The neon lights of Seoul reflect off the wet pavement as a black luxury sedan comes to a halt. Joon-Seok steps out, jet black hair perfectly styled, his tailored suit jacket open to reveal the intricate rose tattoos etched across his chest. He is the definition of power. But as he moves, he stops dead. Something has brushed against his silver bracelet. Not a threat, not a weapon. A crumpled $5 bill. He looks down. Standing in the rain is Naomi, a 6-year-old girl with a pink ponytail and eyes so wide they seem to hold the weight of the entire world. Her small hands are shaking as she holds the money out to a man the rest of the city won't even look at. His enforcers close in, shadows in the night, ready to clear the obstacle, but Joon-Seok raises a hand and the world freezes. No one approaches him like this. People pay him in silence. They pay him in territory. They pay him in blood. No one has ever offered him $5. Joon-Seok crouches, his sharp jawline tightening as he drops to her eye level on the damp asphalt. "What is this, little one?" His voice is a low, dangerous silk. Naomi swallows hard, her bottom lip trembling. "I need to hire you," she whispers. "The police said they can't help, but my mommy told me that if the world ever went dark, I should look for the man with the rose." Joon-Seok's eyes narrow. The air around them turns cold. He slowly takes the bill, not because he needs the money, but because he just realized the contract he's about to sign is personal. "Stay with me until the end," because the last words Naomi whispered next, the message her mother left for him, would force the most ruthless man in the city to burn everything down to bring her home. The city of Seoul didn't just respect Joon-Seok, it held its breath whenever he moved. From the high-rise boardrooms of Gangnam to the neon-drenched alleyways of Itaewon, his influence was a silent, suffocating weight. He was a ghost in a tailored suit, a man who orchestrated the movements of thousands with a single nod. To the public, he was a billionaire venture capitalist. But to those who lived in the shadows, he was the sovereign, the final word in a world where mercy was a currency he simply didn't trade in. His business was built on a foundation of absolute untouchability. He didn't have rivals, he had lessons. His enforcers were more than just muscle. They were a wall of iron and stone, trained to neutralize a threat before it could even formulate a thought. On this rain-slicked evening, that wall was out in full force. 6 men, each standing like an obsidian pillar, formed a protective perimeter around his sedan. They were the elite, the Black Shields, men who had looked down the barrels of guns without blinking. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and expensive cologne, a private bubble of power that no ordinary person would dare approach. The local shopkeepers had already pulled their shutters down, and the few pedestrians on the street ducked their heads, walking faster to escape the gravity of his presence. Then, the impossible happened. A small figure, barely reaching the waist of the nearest guard, breached the perimeter. She didn't sneak, she didn't hide. Naomi simply walked through the gap between 2 enforcers as if they were nothing more than shadows. The guard on the left reached for his holster, his instinct screaming at the breach, but he froze. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a professional assassin. It was a little girl in a pink shirt, her hair damp from the drizzle, clutching a crumpled piece of paper in her fist. The Black Shields moved to intercept, their movements robotic and lethal, but Joon-Seok's hand shot out. It was a sharp, silent command that halted them mid-stride. He watched, his dark eyes narrowing, as this tiny child ignored the glint of tactical gear and the cold stares of killers. She walked straight up to him, stepping into his personal space, a zone where even his highest-ranking lieutenants feared to tread. The silence that followed was deafening. The sovereign of Seoul, a man who could topple corporations with a phone call, found himself staring down at a pair of scuffed sneakers. Naomi looked up, her round cheeks flushed with a mix of terror and a bravery that didn't belong in a 6-year-old. She didn't tremble as she reached out, her small fingers brushing against the silver bracelet on his wrist. In that moment, the untouchable myth of Han Joon-Seok was shattered by a child who was too desperate to be afraid. The sovereign wasn't a god to her. He was her last hope. Joon-Seok remained motionless, his eyes locked onto the small, trembling hand extending the $5 bill. The rain continued to fall, whispering against the pavement, but the world felt eerily silent. He reached out, his long, scarred fingers slowly closing over the damp paper. It was a contract, one more binding than any he had signed with the city's elite. He looked into Naomi's large, expressive eyes and saw a reflection of a life he had tried to bury. "Tell me why you're here, Naomi," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to calm the air around them. "Why me?" Naomi took a shuddering breath, her small frame vibrating with the effort to stay upright. "They took her," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the drizzle. "3 days ago, men in a black van. They told me if I went to the police, she'd never come back. They said the police belonged to them." She stepped closer, the scent of lavender and rain clinging to her. "But Mommy," she leaned down right before they pushed her inside. She was crying, but she grabbed my shoulders and told me to be brave. Joon-Seok leaned in, his shadow enveloping the child, as if shielding her from the neon glare of the city. "Tell me, what did she say?" "She said, 'Naomi, if the world goes dark and I don't come home, don't go to the station, go to the docks, find the man with the rose tattoo on his heart. Tell him Kiara needs him.'" The name hit Joon-Seok like a physical blow. Kiara. The air in his lungs turned to ice. He looked down at the intricate black ink sprawling across his chest, visible through his open shirt. The dark, blooming rose that sat directly over his heartbeat. For 15 years he had been the sovereign, a man without a past, a ghost who had risen from the ashes of the slums to rule the skyline. But before the suits, before the blood, and before the crown, there had been a girl with that same laughter. A girl who had shared a single bowl of rice with him when they were nothing but orphans scavenging for survival. He had told her once, in a life that felt like a dream, that if he ever made it, he would mark himself so she could always find him. He had chosen the rose, her favorite flower, as his sigil. He stood up slowly, his movements fluid and dangerous. The shock in his eyes had hardened into a cold, lethal resolve. He didn't see a stranger's child anymore. He saw the living legacy of the only person who had ever truly known his name. The black shields shifted, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The sovereign was gone, replaced by a man who had just found a reason to burn the world down. He looked at the $5 bill in his hand and tucked it into his breast pocket. "The contract is accepted," he murmured, his eyes flashing with a terrifying light. "Let's go find your mother." The elevator in Naomi's building groaned, a rusted cage ascending into a world Han Joon-Seok had spent a decade trying to forget. His polished leather shoes clicked against the stained linoleum of the hallway, a sharp, rhythmic contrast to the flickering fluorescent lights above. His enforcers stood guard at the stairwell, their presence turning the narrow corridor into a fortress, but Joon-Seok barely noticed them. His focus was entirely on the small girl leading him toward apartment 4B. When the door swung open, the air that met him was stale and desperately cold. The heating had clearly been cut off days ago. Joon-Seok stepped inside, his presence filling the cramped living room, making the modest space feel even smaller. There was no television, no luxury, just the quiet, echoing stillness of a home that had been suddenly emptied of its soul. "I stayed in the kitchen," Naomi whispered, her voice small as she pointed toward a wooden table. "Like Mommy said, in case she came back." Joon-Seok walked toward the table and felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest. Spread out across the surface was what Naomi called her emergency kit. It wasn't a phone or a flashlight. It was a single, nearly empty box of generic brand cereal and a half-filled glass of tap water. Beside it lay a piece of construction paper, edges frayed from being gripped too tightly. He picked up the drawing. It was a crude, colorful depiction of two people, a tall woman with long braids and a smaller girl holding a pink balloon. They were standing under a giant red rose. Naomi had drawn it with such intensity that the wax of the crayon had built up in thick, waxy ridges. "I ate one piece of cereal every hour," Naomi said, standing in the center of the dark kitchen, her pink ponytail sagging, "to make it last. But I'm not hungry anymore. I just want her to come home." Joon-Seok looked from the meager ration of cereal to the vibrant, hopeful drawing. The sovereign was a man who calculated life in dividends and territory, but here the math was simple and devastating. This child had been rationing crumbs and hope in a freezing room while he sat in a penthouse high above the clouds. He thought of Kiara, the girl who had once shared her only crust of bread with him in a rain-drenched alley, and realized she had raised a daughter just as fierce and selfless as she was. He didn't realize his hand was trembling until he saw the drawing shake. The stone heart that had served as his armor for 15 years didn't just crack, it began to crumble. He carefully set the drawing back down and turned to his lead enforcer, who stood like a statue in the doorway. "Bring the car around," Joon-Seok commanded, his voice vibrating with a newfound, terrifying heat. "And tell the kitchen at the estate to prepare a meal, a real one." He looked back at Naomi, his shadow stretching across the cold floor. "You won't be eating crackers tonight, Naomi, and by tomorrow your mother will be the one setting this table." The glass-walled boardroom atop the Atlas Tower overlooked a city that looked like a circuit board of flickering neon and cold ambition. Inside, the atmosphere was even colder. 12 men, the architects of Seoul's underground, sat in high-backed leather chairs, their faces etched with confusion and a growing sense of unease. They had been summoned for a black meeting, an emergency protocol reserved for declaration of war or the death of a king. Han Joon-Seok stood at the head of the table, his tailored suit jacket discarded, the rose tattoo on his chest glowing under the recessed lights like a warning sign. He didn't sit. He leaned over the polished mahogany, his shadow stretching across the maps and ledgers of their multi-billion-dollar empire. "As of this moment," Joon-Seok began, his voice a low, terrifying rasp that cut through the murmurs like a blade. "All revenue streams are frozen. The drug shipments in Incheon stay on the ships. The high-stakes tables in Gangnam are closed. Every enforcer, every runner, and every informant we have on the payroll is being reassigned." A ripple of shock went through the room. "Sir," one lieutenant ventured, his voice trembling, "we're talking about a loss of $40 million a day. The board, the stakeholders will demand an explanation. What business is so urgent that we paralyze the entire syndicate?" Joon-Seok reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled $5 bill. He smoothed it out on the table with a slow, deliberate motion. The men stared at the small, pathetic piece of currency as if it were a foreign relic. "We are no longer in the business of logistics or protection," Joon-Seok said, his eyes scanning the room with a lethal intensity that made the lieutenants look away. We are in the business of finding Kiara Zendai. She was taken by the Ghost Runners 3 days ago. They operated in my streets. They threatened a child in my city." He slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "The Ghost Runners think they are invisible because they trade in humans instead of heroin. They think because they are small, they are beneath our notice. They are wrong. If we cannot protect one woman who knew my name, then this empire is a house of cards. I want every warehouse searched. I want every harbor scanned. If you find anyone associated with the Runners, do not kill them yet. I want them to tell me where she is before they disappear." He looked at the $5 bill one last time before looking back up. Business is paused. Justice is now the only currency I'll accept. Get out. The sub-basement of the Atlas Tower hummed with the electric drone of high-end servers and the frantic clicking of mechanical keyboards. In this sterile, windowless room, information was weaponized. Joon-Seok stood behind his lead analyst, his gaze fixed on a wall of monitors that bathed his face in a flickering blue light. He hadn't slept, and the rose on his chest seemed to pulse with a dark, restless energy. "We found a link, sir," the analyst whispered, his voice tight with the stress of working under the Sovereign's direct shadow. "The Ghost Runners aren't just invisible, they're parasites. They've been piggybacking on our logistics routes, using the gaps in our patrol schedules to move their cargo." Joon-Seok's jaw tightened. They hadn't just committed a crime, they had committed a sacrilege. They had used his own infrastructure to transport their misery. "Show me," Joon-Seok commanded. The main screen flickered to life. The footage was grainy, taken from a hacked burner phone found in a dumpster 3 blocks from Naomi's apartment. It was a digital ghost, a fragment of a nightmare. In the frame, a black van with rusted panels slid into view. 2 men, their faces obscured by surgical masks, dragged a woman toward the sliding door. Joon-Seok felt the air leave his lungs. It was Kiara. She fought with a desperate, feral strength, her long braids swinging as she threw her weight against her captors. Even through the digital noise, her terror was palpable. Then, the camera caught a split-second glimpse of her face as she looked toward the window where Naomi had been hiding. She wasn't screaming for herself. She was mouthing a silent promise to the daughter she was leaving behind. One of the men struck her, a heavy, careless blow that made Joon-Seok's hands curl into white-knuckled fists. As they shoved her into the darkness of the van, the camera caught a glimpse of a logo on the vehicle's rear door, a stylized white crane. "Hanjin Industrial Docks," the analyst said, his fingers flying across the keys to enhance the image. "It's a defunct shipping front. They aren't leaving the city, sir. They're staging. There's an outgoing freighter scheduled for midnight. Once she's on that boat, she officially ceases to exist." Joon-Seok stared at the frozen image of the van, his eyes burning with a cold, predatory fire. The Ghost Runners had made a fatal mistake. They thought they could operate in the cracks of his empire, hiding in the places he didn't look. But they had forgotten that Joon-Seok was the king of the shadows, and he was about to bring the sun down on their heads. "Mobilize the strike teams," Joon-Seok said, his voice a lethal whisper that seemed to vibrate the very monitors. "No sirens, no warnings. We aren't just going to the docks, we're going to war." The Hanjin Industrial Docks were a graveyard of rusted iron and shattered promises, swallowed by a fog that smelled of salt and industrial decay. Beneath the flickering hum of sodium lamps, the Ghost Runners felt secure, hidden behind high chain-link fences and the arrogant belief that they were too small to be hunted. They didn't hear the engines of the black sedans because Joon-Seok's men had cut the lights and rolled to a stop 2 blocks away. They didn't see the shadows detaching themselves from the darkness. Han Joon-Seok moved at the center of the formation, a predator in a tailored suit. He didn't carry a firearm. He didn't need to. Behind him, the black shields moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. This wasn't a street brawl. It was a surgical excision. The first sentry at the gate didn't even have time to gasp. A gloved hand clamped over his mouth while a blade found the soft tissue behind his ear. He was lowered to the concrete without a sound. No flashy displays, no shouted warnings, just the grim, efficient work of men who had turned violence into a quiet art form. They moved through the labyrinth of shipping containers like ghosts, neutralizing guards in the time it took for a heart to beat. A lookout on a crane was pulled into the abyss. Two men sharing a cigarette behind a forklift simply vanished into the shadows, leaving only a glowing ember on the ground. Joon-Seok reached the perimeter of Warehouse 7, his eyes fixed on the black van with the white crane logo parked by the loading dock. His chest burned, the rose tattoo feeling like a brand against his skin. Every silent takedown, every snapped neck was a payment on the $5 contract he carried in his pocket. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the sound of barking orders and the heavy thud of crates being moved. The ghost runners were rushing, sensing the midnight deadline. They had no idea that the perimeter they relied on had already ceased to exist. Joon-Seok stood before the heavy steel side door, his reflection distorted in the metal. He didn't wait for a breach charge. He signaled his lead enforcer, who stepped forward with a hydraulic spreader. With a groan of protesting metal that was drowned out by the sudden roar of the wind, the door gave way. Joon-Seok stepped into the yellow haze of the warehouse, his presence a sudden chilling vacuum that sucked the oxygen out of the room. The men inside froze, their hands hovering over their weapons, their eyes widening as they recognized the man who had just walked out of their nightmares. "The business of the ghost runners," Joon-Seok said, his voice a low, melodic promise of death, "is officially closed for the night." The air inside the warehouse was heavy with the smell of exhaust and old grease. But as Han Joon-Seok stepped further into the light, the temperature seemed to drop to a terminal chill. The leader of the ghost runners, a man with hollow eyes and a jagged scar across his throat, backed away from a stack of crates, his hand hovering near a pistol he was suddenly too terrified to draw. He recognized the rose on Joon-Seok's chest. Everyone in the underworld knew that when the sovereign came for you in person, there was no negotiation, only an ending. "Joon-Seok," the man stammered, his voice cracking. This is a misunderstanding. We didn't know the woman was yours. We can settle this. I have $500,000 in the office upstairs. It's yours, all of it, plus a 20% cut of every shipment we move this year. Just walk away." Joon-Seok didn't respond immediately. He walked past the man toward a heavy iron cage at the back of the room. Inside, Kiara was huddled against the bars, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and recognition. He saw the bruises on her arms and the way she flinched, and the fury in his veins turned into a quiet, white-hot vacuum. He signaled to his men, who moved with clinical precision to cut the lock. As the cage door swung open, he finally turned his gaze back to the trafficker. "You think I'm here for a cut?" Joon-Seok asked. The question was soft, almost melodic, which made it infinitely more terrifying. The trafficker gestured frantically at the crates. "1 million! I'll make it 1 million! Cash right now! You're a businessman, Han. Think of the margins. Why burn a bridge over one woman?" Joon-Seok reached into the breast pocket of his suit. He didn't pull out a weapon or a ledger. He pulled out a crumpled, rain-dampened $5 bill. He held it up between two fingers, the small piece of currency looking absurdly fragile against the backdrop of the industrial slaughterhouse. "I'm a businessman," Joon-Seok murmured, his eyes locking onto the traffickers with a lethal finality. And a businessman never breaks a signed agreement. I've already been paid for this job. I'm already under contract. The trafficker stared at the $5, his face paling as the realization hit him. He wasn't being outbid by a rival. He was being erased because of a child's hope. "Your business," Joon-Seok said, stepping forward as the black shields closed the circle around the room, "is officially terminated." He didn't look back as he reached out to help Kiara stand. Behind him, the shadows of his men moved in, and the screams of the ghost runners were swallowed by the vast, uncaring silence of the docks. The sovereign had fulfilled his contract, and in the world of Han Joon-Seok, debt was always settled in full. The black sedan pulled up to the curb of the quiet apartment block just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed into the sky. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic dripping from the rusted fire escapes, and the city felt unusually still, as if it were holding its breath for what was about to happen. Han Joon-Seok remained in the front seat, his silhouette a sharp, dark anchor against the lightening horizon. He didn't get out. He simply watched through the glass as the rear door opened. Kiara stepped out first. She moved slowly, her body stiff from the ordeal at the docks, but as her feet touched the pavement of her own street, her posture changed. She looked up at the fourth-floor window where a single light was burning. From the shadows of the building's entrance, a small flash of pink appeared. Naomi didn't wait for her mother to reach the door. She burst out onto the sidewalk, her scuffed sneakers slapping against the wet concrete, her pink ponytail bouncing with every desperate stride. She didn't scream, she didn't make a sound. The silence of the street was filled only by the ragged intake of her breath as she threw herself at her mother's waist. Kiara collapsed to her knees on the damp pavement, her arms wrapping around Naomi with a fierce, trembling strength. They stayed there for a long time, two figures huddled together in the center of a world that had tried to tear them apart. Kiara buried her face in Naomi's neck, her shoulders shaking with silent, heaving sobs, while Naomi held on with a grip that suggested she would never let go again. It was a reunion that transcended words, a restoration of a universe that had been broken for 3 days. Inside the car, Joon-Seok watched the scene, his face a mask of iron. His lead enforcer glanced at him in the rearview mirror. "Should I go tell them you're here, sir, to let them know it was the syndicate that brought her back?" Joon-Seok's eyes didn't waver from the mother and daughter. "No," he said, his voice a low, steady hum. "They don't need to know the name of the man who did this. They only need to know that the world isn't as dark as they thought." He looked down at his hand, which still felt the phantom weight of a $5 bill. He had been a merchant of fear for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to be a merchant of hope. As Kiara finally stood up, lifting Naomi into her arms to carry her back inside, Joon-Seok tapped the glass once. The sedan pulled away from the curb, merging into the shadows of the waking city. He left them with their peace, refusing to claim the credit for a contract that had already paid him in a currency he hadn't known he was missing. The seasons in Seoul shifted from the biting chill of spring to the heavy, humid heat of midsummer, but the high-altitude silence of Han Joon-Seok's office remained unchanged. The glass walls offered a panoramic view of an empire he had built from nothing, a sprawling network of lights and shadows that he controlled with a mere whisper. On his massive mahogany desk sat a stack of multi-million-dollar contracts, each awaiting his signature, each representing a world of cold calculation and ruthless gain. Yet, as the sun began to dip behind the skyscrapers, casting long golden fingers across the room, Joon-Seok didn't look at the ledgers. Instead, his gaze was fixed on a small, simple frame hanging on the wall directly opposite his chair. Inside, behind museum-grade glass, sat a single crumpled $5 bill. It was stained with old rain and creased from the grip of a terrified child, looking utterly out of place amidst the Italian marble and polished steel. Beside it was a new addition, a drawing of a man with a rose on his chest, holding hands with a little girl in a pink shirt. Joon-Seok leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking softly. For years he had measured his worth by the fear he inspired and the territory he seized. He had been a man drifting toward a dark horizon, shedding his humanity piece by piece until he was more machine than mentor. He had believed that power was a shield, but Naomi had shown him it was actually a responsibility. He reached up, tracing the faint outline of the rose tattoo beneath his shirt. He had spent his life thinking he was the one who granted favors, the one who decided who lived and who broke. He had thought that night at the docks was an act of charity. But as he looked at that $5 bill, the truth hit him with a quiet, devastating clarity. He hadn't saved Naomi and Kiar. They had saved him. Naomi hadn't just hired a gunman, she had summoned the ghost of the boy who once shared a bowl of rice in the rain. She had forced him to remember that his hands were meant for more than just crushing rivals. They were meant to hold back the dark. That $5 contract was the only honest business he had ever conducted. It was the only deal that hadn't cost him a piece of his soul. Instead, it had bought it back. The sovereign of Seoul stood up, his silhouette sharp against the twilight. He wasn't a monster anymore, and he wasn't just a businessman. He was a guardian. He adjusted his jacket, the rose on his chest, hidden but pulsing with a renewed purpose. He walked out of the office, leaving the millions on his desk untouched, carrying the weight of a $5 debt that he would spend the rest of his life trying to repay.